From the National Press Club in Washington, D.C., this is Update-1, the club's official podcast. It features newsworthy stories originating from the NPC facilities, as well as broader topics related to journalism, communications, press freedom, and transparency.
I'm Adam Konowe, co-chair of the National Press Club's broadcast podcast team. Joining me is Tom Young, a fellow team member here at the club. He's also author of the new book, The Mapmaker, due for release on July 22nd. Tom, welcome to Update-1.
Well, thank you, Adam. Good to see you.
Let's start with you before we get to the book. You have a background in both aviation and journalism. Tell us about those.
Yes, I will admit to a strange dual career in two very different fields. And I've been interested in both of those fields pretty much all my adult life. When I first started college at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, I seriously considered going through Air Force ROTC and pursuing a career full-time in military aviation. But at the time, I was also very interested in writing and journalism. And in my youthful ignorance, I thought I had to choose one or the other and never look back. So for a long time, I pursued journalism pretty single-mindedly. I worked for the broadcast division of the Associated Press for 10 years. But during that time, I started taking private pilot flying lessons, and that was like pouring gas on a fire. I found out I loved flying, had a passion for it. I found out I had an aptitude for it, so I wanted to experience more of it. So I joined the Air National Guard. I became a flight engineer on C-130s and then on C-5s. And the military experience helped pull me toward the airlines. So about a year ago, I retired as an airline captain. So what a long, strange trip it's been.
Yeah. Well, so talk a little more about how these different careers as a decorated military flight engineer, a commercial pilot, and a broadcast journalist, how did those all sort of inform your approach as an author?
All of that helped. The journalism experience, of course, taught me how to write a decent sentence and how to do it on deadline. The military experience gave me lots of material to work with. I've always been interested in writing fiction as well as in journalism. In fact, while I was studying broadcast journalism at UNC Chapel Hill, I also went through the English department's creative writing program. And after college, throughout adult life, I took the occasional fiction writing workshop or attended the occasional fiction writing conference. And along the way, I had a few short stories published in literary magazines, but I never had a good idea for a novel that I could really sink my teeth into until 9/11 came along and my unit got activated and we began flying in and out of Afghanistan and then later in and out of Iraq. And as you might imagine, that gave me plenty of material to work with. So I did a series of military-related novels set in present-day conflicts, and then more recently I've turned to historical fiction, and The Mapmaker is my third World War II novel.
I want to talk about those books, but you mentioned the military service, and you're also commander of American Legion Post 20, which is based here at the National Press Club. So before we get into your books and, of course, the most recent one, what can you share about your role with Post 20 and the history of that organization?
Oh, I'm glad you asked about that. American Legion Post 20 has been affiliated with the National Press Club for more than a century. The Post has been affiliated with the club for all of the Post history and for almost all of the Press Club's history, too. And it has a fascinating origin story. But at the end of World War I, the famous General John J. Pershing, Blackjack Pershing, was one of the founders of the American Legion. And at the time, he was an associate member of the Press Club. And he was pretty media savvy for the media of his day. And he realized, hey, here at the Press Club at that time, there were lots of World War I veterans. And he thought, what better way to get good publicity for this new American Legion than to have a Legion post right here at the Press Club. And we've been here ever since. And along the way, we've had some illustrious post members and post commanders. Just a couple of examples. The Cosgrove Lounge here at the Press Club is named for a beloved Press Club president, John Cosgrove, who was inaugurated in 1961. But he also served as a commander of Post 20. He was a World War II veteran. He served in the Navy, and his destroyer escort survived multiple kamikaze attacks. It's really quite a story. And he survived all that, made it home to have a brilliant career in journalism. Then we have the McClendon Room, named for Sarah McClendon, the famous founder of the McClendon News Service, White House correspondent. She, too, was a World War II veteran, and she was also one of Post 20's commanders. And along the way, we've had other very accomplished members. As we speak, Post 20 has a member who's a former astronaut and another member who was a superintendent of West Point.
That's amazing. Well, let's talk about writing. So a little more perhaps on what drew you to long-form writing and particularly historical novels, and then we'll get into your newest one.
I've always loved novels. I think I've always known I wanted to write novels. A good novel is a world in which you can lose yourself. You can pick up a novel from your nightstand and read it for a few minutes before you go to sleep every night and enter a different world, a different time, see the world from someone else's eyes. It's just a wonderful form of entertainment. And I think no matter how sophisticated and electronic our entertainment media become, there'll always be a place for a good novel, because pictures on a screen will never be more vivid than the pictures in your own mind.
I love that. Before we get into the specifics of the Mapmaker, just some quick mechanical things. When did you start writing, and how long did that process take?
Well, there's a couple of ways I could answer that question. I think I've known I wanted to be a writer from the time I could read. But I'll tell you the story about when I first actually started writing my first commercially successful novel. I was still flying in the military at that time, and I'd had this idea for a war story set in Afghanistan rolling around in the back of my head for some time, and I just never had time to start writing it. The novel eventually became a novel titled The Mullah's Storm. It came out in 2010. But meanwhile, in 2007, I had not yet started to write that novel, and I was with the crew of a C-5 Galaxy flying a load of cargo into Osan Air Base, South Korea. And on the way into Osan, we had multiple problems with the airplane. We lost a generator, so we had an electrical problem. We lost a hydraulic system, so we had hydraulic problems, and there were a couple of other serious malfunctions. I forget everything that was wrong with that darn airplane, but it was bad enough that we declared an emergency. And as we landed at Osan, we were greeted by the flashing lights of the crash trucks, but we landed safely, thankfully. And as we taxied off the runway and down the taxiway and across the ramp into parking, we dripped a trail of hydraulic fluid like a wounded pterodactyl. And when we shut down that airplane and started talking to maintenance and writing up everything that was wrong with it, we realized we were going to get stuck at Osan for days. So I found myself in Osan, South Korea, with time on my hands. So the next day, I woke up in aircrew billeting, and I walked to the BX, the base exchange, and I bought a yellow legal pad. And then I went to the base coffee shop, and I got myself a good, strong cup of black mil-spec coffee. And I sat down on a couch in aircrew billeting, and I wrote at the top of that legal pad, Chapter 1. That was the beginning of the manuscript that became The Mullah's Storm, my first novel. That first novel turned into a 6-book series, and then I turned to historical fiction set in World War II. So you might say all of this started with an aircraft emergency in South Korea.
Fortuitous for us, if somewhat inconvenient for you. So, as you mentioned, The Mapmaker is a World War II thriller. It's set in the weeks before D-Day. Why that particular period?
Well, by now, it's been 80 years since the end of World War II. World War II has become pretty well-tilled ground for fiction. So I tried to look for some of the lesser-known corners of World War II history. And one of those corners that I found very fascinating was the air operations that supported the French resistance. The British RAF, the Royal Air Force, had what they called special duty squadrons. Nowadays, we would call it special operations. And they did some really swashbuckling, daring stuff to support the French resistance. A lot of it involved flying light single-engine aircraft into clandestine airfields at night, just navigating by moonlight to bring supplies and ammunition to the resistance. Sometimes they would pick up resistance agents and fly them back to London for consultations and then fly them right back to France and send them right back into the fray. It's a hell of a way to commute to and from work, but they did it.
Your book centers on two resistance fighters, an American operative named Charlotte Konowe and a French pilot called Philippe Girard. Introduce us to them and what circumstance brings them together.
Charlotte is a French-American woman working with the resistance, and she's a former art student, and she has turned her talents to drawing maps and charts and diagrams and so forth to help give the Allies information on German positions, German capabilities. The problem is she's a little bit too good, and the Gestapo knows about her, and she's on the run. The Gestapo is trying to track her down and drag her into an interrogation center. And what she really needs is a flight out. She needs to get the heck out of France to get her information to the Allies. Meanwhile, Philippe is a French pilot who escaped occupied France and began flying with the British RAF, and he's in one of these special duty squadrons we talked about, and he gets tasked with finding Charlotte and flying her out. But the problem is that's hard to do because she's on the run and she can't stay in one place for very long. And even if he does get information about where she is, supposedly, is that good information, or is it the Nazis trying to draw him into a trap? So that's the setup for the beginning of the Mapmaker.
Fiction allows certain liberties, but you did extensive research on top of your knowledge of aviation and military history. Talk about the parallels between your characters and the situations in which you place them with what actually happened during World War II.
Yes, the characters are based on real-life figures. Charlotte is very much based on very brave women who served in the resistance, such as Virginia Hall. She was an American woman who worked initially with the British Special Operations Executive and then later with the American Office of Strategic Services, coordinating with the French resistance. Charlotte is also sort of informed by other women such as Violette Szabo, another very brave woman, and Violette Szabo did not survive the war. Philippe is inspired by pilots from Nazi-occupied countries that got out of occupied Europe, made their way to Britain, and continued the fight as members of the British RAF. There were pilots from France, Poland, Belgium, and other countries who did that. As a matter of fact, I was just recently in Normandy, and I stumbled across a memorial to Belgian pilots who were flying with the RAF and participated in the liberation of France.
I was also struck by your use of fictional memoranda attributed to real-life Gestapo head and war criminal Klaus Barbie. What was your thought process there?
I'm glad that worked for you. To an extent, I borrowed that idea from one of my literary heroes, Herman Wouk, who's the author of great World War II novels such as The Winds of War and War in Remembrance. He intersperses those novels with memoirs from a fictional German general, a General Armin von Roon. And that way, as the story progresses, he's giving the German perspective. Similarly, in the Mapmaker, I used fictitious memoranda from a Gestapo officer, Klaus Barbie, to show the German perspective as they are pursuing Charlotte. The memoranda are completely made up. I made those up. They're purely fictional. Sadly, Klaus Barbie is not made up. He was a real-world figure. He was known, in fact, as the Butcher of Lyon. And for a long time, he escaped justice. He got out of Europe at the end of World War II. He escaped to South America, where he lived under the alias Klaus Altmann. In 1971, the Nazi hunters Serge and Beate Klarsfeld identified him as living in South America, and he was extradited to France. And in 1987, he was convicted and sentenced to life in prison, but he did not live much longer after that. He died of cancer in 1991.
As a fictional writer, I'm sure you had no problem creating those memoranda, but I just have to ask, as a journalist, did the journalist in you feel a little weird writing memoranda attributed to a real person?
Yes, but you can get away with a lot in fiction. But the journalism experience sometimes is sitting on my shoulder saying, you can't do that. And then as a fiction author, I'm saying, yes, I can.
All right. So, I mean, The Mapmaker is not your first piece of military fiction, as we know. So what have you learned over the years in writing for this genre?
One of the things I've learned is you have to do your research. There is so much to know, both technically and historically. For example, there's always going to be someone who knows more than I do about the M1 rifle. There's always going to be someone who knows more than I do about the B-17 Flying Fortress. And I'm never going to be an expert in all of that, but you have to do enough research so that you hope you don't make any egregious technical errors, because if you do, that ruins the story for the people who are experts on that stuff. And getting back to one of my literary heroes, Herman Wouk, he was a World War II veteran. He was there, but even he spent 13 years researching the winds of war and remembrance. In fact, if memory serves, I believe he read something like 300 nonfiction books as he prepared to write those novels, because he wanted to hold the entire war in his head to the extent that that's possible. So if someone like Herman Wouk has to do that kind of research, I certainly know I do, because he was there and I wasn't.
That's fair. So what's next? Will we see one or more of these characters again, or will the next book be something completely different?
I'm not exactly sure what form my next novel will take, but I can tell you about another lesser-known corner of World War II history that I've been researching. And it's also a fairly unknown corner of Virginia history as well. But in the 1930s, there was a very successful Jewish businessman in Richmond, a department store magnate named William B. Thalheimer. And if you grew up in the 70s, as I did, in the Upper South, Thalheimer's department stores were ubiquitous. But he was building that empire in the 1930s, and he was very well connected, and he knew what was happening on the international scene. He was the national chairman of something called the Refugee Resettlement Committee, and he was very much aware of what was happening in Germany at that time. And he wanted to help as many Jewish refugees as he could. He had contacts with an agricultural school where Jewish teenagers were learning to farm. It was a place called the Gross Briesen Agricultural Institute. And he set up a plan to get those young people out of Germany, to settle them on a farm he bought in southern Virginia, and thereby help them escape the war. He pulled it off, but he did it barely in the nick of time. The day of Kristallnacht, or I think the day after Kristallnacht, the Gestapo raided that school, and the male students were taken to Buchenwald, which was a disaster in the making. Thalheimer and his contacts got word of this, and through the State Department, it was communicated to the Berlin government, hey, you just arrested a bunch of kids who have visas to come to the U.S. Maybe it's not in your interest to tick off a then neutral, powerful industrial country. So those kids were released from Buchenwald. Not a lot of people were released from Buchenwald. They made their way. They made their way to Virginia. They settled on that farm. In 1941, when Pearl Harbor happened and we got involved in the war, a lot of those male students joined the military, and one of them went back to Buchenwald with Patton's Third Army as part of the liberating force. So that's quite a story. And that's what I've been researching lately.
Okay. I eagerly await that. That sounds amazing. Tom, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you. Pleasure talking to you.
Tom Young is author of the upcoming novel The Mapmaker for Update-1 in Washington. I'm Adam Konowe.
You have been listening to Update-1, the official podcast of the National Press Club, the world's leading professional organization for journalists and a vigorous advocate of press freedom worldwide. If you have any questions or comments about Update-1, Send an email to update1podcast@gmail.com.